I was fixing the old clock when my son walked into my room. The gears had been silent for 3 months, just like everything else in this house that once mattered. "Dad," he said, not looking at me, watching my fingers work the tiny springs, "we need to talk." I didn't stop. The mechanism was delicate. One wrong move and 40 years of keeping time would be lost forever. "You've become an anchor for us," he said quietly. "We're drowning." My fingers froze for just a second. The screwdriver slipped, but I caught it before it could scratch the face. I've been careful with fragile things my whole life. He waited for me to say something. When I didn't, he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, the way he used to do as a boy when he'd broken something and was waiting for punishment. "The house is too much for you now," he continued. "The stairs, the maintenance, all of it. Sarah found a good place, clean, safe, people your age." I set down the screwdriver and looked at him. Really looked. When had his face become so hard? When had his eyes learned to avoid mine? "It's not about the money," he said, but his voice carried the lie like dust carries on wind. "It's about what's best for everyone." I picked up the clock face, held it to the light. The numbers were still clear, still honest. Time doesn't lie, even when it stops. "We'll pack your things next week," he said. "Just the essentials. You won't need much." He left without waiting for an answer. He hadn't asked a question anyway. I sat there for a long time, holding the broken timepiece. Through the window, I could see Sarah in the garden pulling up the roses I'd planted for my wife. She worked quickly, efficiently, like someone erasing evidence. They didn't know I'd heard them last night. Planning, calculating, dividing up rooms that weren't theirs to divide. I wound the clock's spring, feeling the resistance, the way it fought against being forced. But I didn't force it. I waited, listening to its rhythm, understanding what it needed. Some things, when you push them too hard, they break forever. Other things, when you know how to touch them, they wake up. I placed the clock back on my nightstand and walked to the closet. Behind my winter coats, behind boxes of Christmas decorations that would never see another December in this house, I felt for the corner of an envelope. My wife's handwriting, faded but still firm. "Don't open unless absolutely necessary." 37 years I'd kept that promise. I guess it was time to see what she'd been saving for a moment like this. But not tonight. Tonight, I would let them sleep peacefully in their certainty, in their plans, in their belief that an old man has no cards left to play. I turned off the light and listened to the house settle around me. Every creak, every whisper of wind through the eaves, this house knew my voice. It would remember me long after they'd forgotten. In the darkness, I smiled for the first time in months. Tomorrow, we would see who was really drowning. The next morning, Sarah was already rearranging the living room when I came down for coffee. My chair, the leather recliner I'd bought with my first promotion check in 1982, was pushed against the wall like furniture waiting for donation. "We're making space," she said without looking up. "The movers said they need clear pathways." I poured my coffee into the blue mug with the chip on the handle. My wife had bought it at a roadside stand during our honeymoon. Sarah took it from my hands before I could take the first sip. "This old thing?" She held it up to the light, examining the crack like evidence of decay. I've been meaning to throw it out. It's not hygienic." She dropped it in the trash bin. The sound of porcelain breaking is very specific, very final. I stood there holding my coffee in a plain white cup that had no history, no memory, no story. It tasted different, emptier. "We're having dinner with the Hendersons tonight," she announced, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "They're very excited about the house. They've been looking in this neighborhood for months." My son emerged from the kitchen, already dressed for work. "The realtor will be here at 2, he said, buttoning his coat. "Just to look around. Get an estimate." They moved through the morning routine like surgeons, precise and detached, cutting away pieces of my life with the efficiency of people who'd practiced. After they left, I walked through the rooms they were already selling in their minds. In the hallway, the family photos had been taken down, replaced by generic art Sarah had bought at Home Goods. My grandchildren's drawings, once proudly displayed on the refrigerator, were gone. I found them in the garbage, under coffee grounds and yesterday's newspaper. The basement was worse. Boxes of my things, tools, books, records, were labeled in Sarah's neat handwriting, "Donate," "Sell," "Trash." Nothing was labeled "Keep." In one box, I found the wooden duck I'd carved for my grandson's 5th birthday. He'd carried it everywhere for months, talked to it, made it fly around the house, making airplane noises. Now it sat among other forgotten things, waiting to be priced at a garage sale. I climbed back upstairs and sat on the porch, watching Mrs. Patterson across the street tend her garden. She waved, and I waved back. We'd been neighbors for 34 years. She probably didn't know I was leaving. At 2 o'clock, the realtor arrived, a young woman in a sharp suit who spoke in square footage and market values. She walked through my home like she was measuring a corpse. "Great bones," she told my son, who'd returned from work early. "This neighborhood's hot right now. You'll get asking price, maybe more." They stood in the kitchen, discussing countertops and paint colors, improvements that would erase any trace that I'd ever lived here. The realtor suggested removing the bird feeder outside the window. "Attracts pests," she said. My wife had filled that feeder every morning for 23 years. She'd known every cardinal, every blue jay, every sparrow that came to visit. After she died, I kept filling it because I knew she was still watching, still caring about the small, hungry things. That evening, I sat at the dinner table while they discussed my future like I wasn't there. The Hendersons were nice people, too nice to know they were buying stolen ground. "He'll love Sunset Manor," Mrs. Henderson said, smiling at me with the forced brightness people use around the dying. "My mother was there for 3 years. Such a lovely community." 3 years. That's all she'd lasted. After they left, I went to my room and pulled out the envelope again. The paper was soft with age, yellow at the edges. My wife's words seemed to glow in the lamplight. I thought about that morning in 1987 when she'd sealed this envelope. I thought about the promise I'd made, the secret I'd kept, the burden I'd carried so they could sleep peacefully in a house they thought was theirs. I thought about drowning men and who really held the life preserver. But not yet. Not tonight. I put the envelope back in its hiding place and listened to them moving around downstairs, probably discussing which of my things they'd keep as sentimental tokens. A photo here, a book there, breadcrumbs of a life they were already forgetting. The broken clock on my nightstand stared at me with its still hands. Time had stopped for it, but not for me, not yet. 2 weeks passed like a slow funeral. The house grew emptier each day, not just of objects, but of the weight that comes from being truly lived in. Sarah had efficiency down to an art form. My books disappeared first, then my tools, then the small things that hold a life together. They moved around me like I was already gone. I started waking at 4 in the morning when the house was still mine. In that gray hour before dawn, I could pretend nothing had changed. I'd make coffee in a paper cup now. All the real mugs were packed away, and walk through rooms that were becoming strangers to me. That's when I finally opened the envelope. My hand shook as I broke the seal my wife had made 37 years ago. Inside, her handwriting was careful, deliberate, like she'd known these words would matter someday. My darling, if you're reading this, it means they've forgotten who built the foundation they're standing on. I hoped this day would never come, but I know you too well. You'll give and give until there's nothing left, and they'll take and take until they think it was always theirs. I had to stop reading, put the letter down, and stare out the window at the garden Sarah had destroyed. Even my wife's voice from beyond the grave knew me better than my own son did. The next page was different paper, older, more formal, a legal document from 1987 that I recognized but hadn't seen in decades. "This is the truth they never knew," my wife had written at the top. "The truth you never let them know." The memories came flooding back like water through a broken dam. August 1987. Michael was 12, already showing signs of the man he'd become. Confident, entitled, sure the world owed him something. The bank had called that morning. The mortgage was 3 months behind. The economy had turned, construction jobs had dried up, and we were drowning in debt. I remember sitting at this same kitchen table, staring at foreclosure papers while my wife made breakfast and pretended everything was normal. Michael was upstairs getting ready for school, complaining about his sneakers being too small, needing new clothes for the upcoming school year. He never knew how close we came to losing everything. The solution had been elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its cost. My father-in-law, a man who'd never liked me but loved his daughter, had offered a deal. He'd buy the house from the bank, let us live in it, let Michael grow up here, but the deed would be in my name only. Legal protection, he'd called it, insurance against future mistakes. The price was 27 years of payments, not just the mortgage, but interest that would make a loan shark blush. Every month for 27 years, I'd written a check to a man who never let me forget I was borrowing space in my own life. I'd paid the last installment on my wife's birthday 6 months before she died. She'd cried that day, not from joy, but from relief. "Now it's really ours," she'd whispered. "Now it's really his." She'd meant Michael's inheritance. What she didn't know was that I'd never changed the deed. In the chaos of her illness, the grief that followed, the way life just kept demanding attention, I'd left the house in my name alone, not from selfishness, from habit, from 37 years of being the only one who remembered what it cost to keep this place. I folded the deed carefully and put it back in the envelope with my wife's letter. On the back page, she'd written one final message. "They don't know what you sacrificed. They don't know what you saved them from. But someday, when they try to take what was never theirs to take, show them this. Show them who really owns the ground they're standing on. And remember, dignity isn't something they can pack in a box and donate. It's the one thing that's always been yours alone. Outside, I could hear Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. She was back from another meeting with the realtor, probably with new papers to sign, new ways to divide up a life that had never been hers to give away. I put the envelope back in its hiding place and sat down to wait. Tomorrow, the movers would come for my things. Tomorrow, I would leave the only home I'd ever really owned. But tonight, for the first time in months, I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. I just had to decide when to let them know who'd been drowning all along. The clock on my nightstand was still broken, hands frozen at 3:17, but inside my chest I could feel something starting to tick again. Something that had been waiting 37 years to finally keep perfect time. They thought they were moving an old man out of his house. They had no idea they were about to discover who the house really belonged to. And once they knew that, they'd learn something else, something my wife had understood from the very beginning. When you build something with your own hands, when you pay for it with your own blood, when you sacrifice everything to keep it standing, it doesn't just belong to you. You belong to it. And it never lets you go without a fight. The movers came at 8 in the morning, 3 men who handled my life like they were loading cargo. I watched from the porch as they carried out boxes labeled in Sarah's handwriting, Dad's clothes, Dad's books, Dad's miscellaneous. Everything I'd accumulated over 72 years reduced to inventory categories. Michael supervised from the driveway, checking items off a list. He'd taken the day off work for this. The first time in years he'd made me his priority, and it was to watch me disappear. The furniture stays, he told the movers, just the personal items. Personal items, as if my life could be separated from the spaces where I'd lived it. Sarah emerged from the house carrying the wooden duck I'd carved for Tommy. "This goes," she said, tossing it into a donation box. "He's too old for toys now." Tommy was 17. He'd stopped playing with the duck when he was 7, but I kept it on my dresser because it reminded me of the boy he'd been before the world taught him that grandfathers were inconvenient. I started to say something, then stopped. The duck wasn't the battle worth fighting. Not yet. By noon, the truck was loaded with 37 years of evidence that I'd existed in this house. The movers drove away, taking my things to a storage unit I'd never see. Sarah had handled the arrangements. "Just temporary," she'd said, "until you settle in at Sunset Manor." We all knew what temporary meant in this context. After lunch, Michael and I sat on the porch one last time. The afternoon was warm, the kind of day my wife used to love. She'd have been in the garden, coaxing life from soil, making things grow in impossible places. "I know this is hard," Michael said, not looking at me, "but it's the right thing. You'll see." I nodded and said nothing. He was right. He just didn't know what was right about it. "Remember when I was 12, I said finally, "and you wanted that bike?" "The red Schwinn?" He shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, we don't need to." "You remember what I told you when you asked why we couldn't afford it? You said money doesn't grow on trees." His voice carried the tired patience adults use with old people who repeat stories. "You worked extra shifts that summer, got me the bike for my birthday." 3 extra shifts every week for 4 months, I said. Overtime on weekends. Missed your baseball games because I was pouring concrete for 12 hours straight. I know, Dad. You were a good provider. No, I said quietly. I wasn't a provider. I was a saver. He looked at me then, really looked, the way he used to when he was small and didn't understand something. What's the difference? Providers give you what you need. Savers give you what you want and pretend it's what you need. I stood up, brushing dust from my pants. The bike wasn't necessary. You had legs, but you wanted it, so I made it happen. What's your point? My point is that I've been saving things for you your whole life. Saving this house when we should have lost it. Saving your college fund when I should have kept it for retirement. Saving your marriage when Sarah's father wouldn't co-sign that business loan and I put up this house as collateral instead. Michael went very still. What are you talking about? 2 years ago, when you started the consulting firm, when the bank wanted security and Sarah's family said no. I met his eyes. You never asked where I got $30,000 to guarantee your loan. The color drained from his face. You said it was savings. It was. Everything I'd saved for the roof repair, the new furnace, the bathroom renovation your mother wanted before she got sick. I gave it all to keep your business afloat. Dad, I didn't know. Of course you didn't know. That's what saving means. You take the weight so they don't feel it. I walked to the porch railing, looking out at the street where I'd pushed him on that red bicycle, where I'd taught him to drive, where I'd watched him leave for college and come back a stranger. But here's what I learned about saving, I continued. Eventually, you run out of things to give up. Eventually, you become the thing that needs to be saved from. Michael was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was smaller. The house? You're not happy about selling it. I'm not selling it, I said simply. What do you mean? We already signed the... You signed papers. I haven't signed anything. I turned to face him. Hard to sell something you don't actually own. His face went through several expressions before settling on confusion. Dad, this is your house, our family home. Of course you own it. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the envelope. The paper felt different now. Not fragile, but powerful. Truth has its own weight. August 1987, I said, opening it carefully. You were 12. The mortgage was behind, and we were 3 weeks from losing everything. You know what happened next? You got that construction job in Millfield, the big one. I got help from your mother's father. He bought this house from the bank and let us stay in it. But he made sure the deed was clear. It went to me alone. Legal protection, he called it. I handed Michael the deed, watched his eyes scan the official language, the stamps, the signatures, watched understanding dawn like sunrise over ruins. This says, his voice trailed off, this says that for 37 years I've been the sole legal owner of this house. Not we, not us, me. Michael read the document again, slower this time. But Mom, she lived here too. She was on the mortgage payments. She helped make payments on a house her husband owned, just like you've been living in a house your father owns. I took the deed back, folded it carefully. The difference is, she knew. She was part of the plan. You just assumed. Why didn't you tell me? Because I was saving you from knowing. Saving you from feeling like a guest in your childhood home. Saving you from understanding what it actually cost to keep you here. Sarah's car pulled into the driveway. She got out carrying shopping bags, already planning what she'd do with the kitchen, how she'd redecorate the master bedroom. She waved at us cheerfully, a woman confident in her upcoming inheritance. "She doesn't know either," Michael said. "Nobody knows except me and your mother, and now you." "Dad, this changes everything. We can't sell a house that isn't ours to sell." "No," I agreed. "You can't." I stood up and walked to the door. "Your mother left something else in that envelope. You might want to read it before your wife starts measuring for new curtains." I left him sitting on the porch, holding 37 years of misunderstanding in his hands. Through the window, I could see Sarah in the kitchen, probably planning where to put the new appliances she'd been browsing online. In my room, I pulled out a suitcase, not the one they'd packed for me, but an old leather one I'd kept in the closet. Inside, I placed the things they'd forgotten to look for: my father's watch, my wife's jewelry, the photos that told the real story of our life together. At the bottom of the suitcase, I put a letter I'd written that morning, not for Michael. He'd have enough to process. This letter was for Sarah, explaining exactly how much she'd overestimated her position in this family. As I packed, I could hear voices from the porch. Michael's rising in panic, Sarah's sharp with disbelief. The sound of people discovering that the ground they'd been standing on was never as solid as they'd believed. Tomorrow morning, I'd drive to the lake house I'd been renting quietly for the past month. A small place where a man could fix clocks and feed birds and not worry about being anyone's anchor. But tonight, I'd sleep one more time in the house I'd built, in the bed I'd shared with the only woman who'd ever understood what love actually costs. And I'd listen to my son and daughter-in-law discover the difference between inheriting something and earning it, the difference between being given a home and making one, the difference between saving someone and being saved. In the morning, they'd wake up in a house that had never been theirs, planning a sale they had no right to make, counting money that was never coming, but tonight was still mine, all of it, every room, every memory, every lesson they were about to learn about the weight of assumptions. I lay down on my bed and smiled at the ceiling my hands had painted, in the room my labor had built, under the roof my sacrifice had kept intact. Tomorrow they'd discover who'd really been drowning all along. Tonight, I'd sleep like a man who'd finally stopped saving people from the consequences of their own ignorance. Some things can't be taught. They can only be learned. And tomorrow, class would begin. I woke before dawn on what would be my last morning in the house, not because I had to leave, because I chose to. There's a difference that most people never understand, but it's the difference between defeat and victory, between running away and walking toward something better. The house was quiet in that deep way that comes before the world wakes up and starts demanding things. I made coffee in a paper cup. All the real mugs were gone now, packed away like evidence of a crime, and sat at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast for 37 years, where I'd helped Michael with homework when he still believed his father knew everything, where my wife had told me she was pregnant, her eyes bright with the kind of hope that only comes once in a lifetime, where we'd planned our future over countless cups of coffee that tasted better than this one ever would. Through the window, I could see the bird feeder hanging empty. Sarah had stopped filling it weeks ago, part of her systematic erasure of my routines. But the Cardinals still came, though. They'd sit on the fence and wait, heads cocked, confused by the absence of the reliability they'd counted on for decades. I knew exactly how they felt. At 7, I heard movement upstairs, urgent whispers, the kind that happen when people realize their world has shifted overnight and they're scrambling to understand the new geography of their lives. Michael's voice, tight with panic, asking questions he should have asked years ago. Sarah's, sharp with disbelief, the tone of a woman discovering that the inheritance she'd been counting was never hers to count. The sound of papers rustling, phone calls being made, reality settling in like cold water over warm skin. I finished my coffee and walked through the house one last time, not as a goodbye, but as an inventory. Every room held ghosts of the man I'd been, the father I'd tried to be, the husband who'd thought that sacrifice was the same thing as love. In the living room, the walls were bare now except for rectangular shadows where our family photos used to hang. Sarah had taken them down to modernize the space for potential buyers. But I knew the real reason. She was erasing evidence that this had ever been anyone's home but hers. The kitchen still smelled faintly of my wife's cooking even after all these years. Cinnamon and vanilla. The scent of Sunday mornings when Michael would run downstairs in his pajamas and she'd have pancakes waiting. Back when being a father meant teaching him to flip them without making a mess, not teaching him to live without making one. I climbed the stairs to my room, my hand trailing along the banister I'd sanded and stained when we first moved in. Michael had been 5 then, small enough to slide down this same banister while his mother pretended to scold him, and I pretended not to enjoy watching him be fearless. The suitcase sat packed on my bed. Not much for 72 years of living, but enough for whatever came next. On the nightstand, the broken clock still showed 3:17, frozen in a moment that felt like a lifetime ago, but was really only the beginning of understanding what time actually meant. I picked up the clock and held it to the morning light streaming through the window. Such a simple mechanism, really. Springs and gears and the faith that time moves forward even when everything else stands still. I'd been trying to fix it for months, but maybe it had been working perfectly all along. Maybe it had been waiting for this exact moment to matter, for this precise second when fixing it would mean something more than just having a working timepiece. I wound the spring carefully, feeling for the resistance, listening for the whisper of metal against metal that meant life returning to something that had been waiting patiently to live again. And then, for the first time in months, it started ticking. 3:18, 3:19, 3:20. Time moving forward again, carrying me with it. I set the clock down gently and picked up 2 pieces of paper I'd prepared the night before. The first was a deed transfer, signed and notarized, making Michael the legal owner of the house that had been mine alone for 37 years. The second was a letter, my final gift to the family that had forgotten what gifts actually cost. The letter was addressed to Michael, but I knew Sarah would read it first. She read everything first: bills, mail, messages from school when he was young, as if she were the filter through which information reached this family. Today, she'd get to filter the truth, and the truth was going to be harder to swallow than she was used to. By the time you read this, I'll be gone, not to Sunset Manor, not to the place you chose for me without asking what I might choose for myself, but to a place I picked, A place where an old man can fix clocks and feed birds and drink coffee from cups that have stories instead of price tags. The house is yours now, legally and completely. I've signed the deed over to you this morning. The real deed, the one that actually matters. The one your grandfather signed in 1987 when he saved our family from losing everything, and I spent the next 27 years paying him back with interest that would make a loan shark blush. But ownership comes with conditions, not legal ones. I'm not that cruel, and your mother raised me better than that. Moral ones. The kind your mother would have insisted on if she were here to see what you've become and what you've forgotten about being human in a world that needs more kindness, not less. First, Mrs. Patterson across the street has been feeding stray cats from her porch for 15 years. The city wants her to stop because someone complained. Probably someone who thinks property values matter more than compassion. I've been paying the fines quietly, $25 a month, because those cats don't understand city ordinances, and Mrs. Patterson doesn't understand why anyone would want them to starve. That stops now. You decide if those cats eat or starve, if your neighbor faces those fines alone, if kindness is worth $25 a month to you. Second, the Hendersons next door are good people trying to raise a son with special needs in a world that doesn't make room for different kinds of children. When Tommy's ball comes over the fence, when he needs help reaching something high, when his parents look exhausted from fighting battles most people never have to fight. I've been there, quietly, without making it about me, because that's what neighbors do. That stops now, too. You decide if you're the kind of neighbor your mother raised you to be, or the kind who closes curtains when help is needed. Third, every month I put $50 in an envelope and leave it in Mrs. Rodriguez's mailbox. Her husband died last year, and her Social Security doesn't cover everything. But pride won't let her ask for help. She doesn't know where the money comes from. She just knows that somehow she can afford groceries, can keep the lights on, can maintain the dignity of independence while accepting the help she needs. That stops today. You decide if she eats or doesn't, if she keeps her lights on or sits in darkness, if your comfort matters more than her survival. These aren't debts you owe me. They're debts you owe to the idea of being human beings in a community, of understanding that we're all connected by threads too thin to see but too strong to ignore without consequences. I never told you about these things because I wanted you to discover generosity on your own. I wanted you to see need and respond to it without being asked, without being thanked, without needing recognition. I wanted you to grow into the man your mother believed you could be when she looked at you with that expression that said you were capable of anything, including goodness. I was wrong to wait. I was wrong to think that kindness was something you'd inherit automatically, like eye color or height or the shape of your mother's smile. Some things have to be taught. Some things have to be demanded. Some things have to be earned through the daily choice to be better than the world expects you to be. The house is yours. Do with it what you will. Paint the walls. Change the locks. Sell it to people who love it better than we did. But remember, walls and windows don't make a home. People make homes. The choices they make, the love they show, the way they treat the world around them when they think nobody's watching. Your mother knew that. I hoped you'd learned it from watching her, from seeing how she moved through the world like kindness was a language she spoke fluently. Maybe you still can. The clock in my room is working now. Listen to it. It's counting the seconds you have left to decide what kind of man you want to be in the time you have remaining. Don't waste them the way I wasted mine, waiting for you to become someone worth saving instead of teaching you how to save yourself. Your father, who loved you enough to finally stop trying to rescue you from the consequences of your own choices. I folded the letter carefully and left it on Michael's pillow, where he'd find it when he came looking for me with questions I was no longer interested in answering. Then I picked up my suitcase and the working clock and walked downstairs for the last time as a resident of this house. In the hallway, I stopped at the family photos Sarah had removed from the walls. They were stacked in a box marked "Sort Later," as if memories could be organized like inventory, as if love could be cataloged and stored. I took one. A picture from Michael's 10th birthday party, all of us laughing at something I couldn't remember now, but could feel in the curve of our smiles. My wife's hand on my shoulder, Michael's gap-toothed grin, the cake she'd made from scratch because store-bought wasn't good enough for her boy, never good enough when love could make something better. That picture went in my jacket pocket, evidence that we'd been happy once, before the world taught us that happiness was something you could lose if you weren't careful enough to guard it from the people who were supposed to help you keep it safe. At the front door, I turned back one last time. The house felt different already, not empty, but expectant, like it knew something was about to change, something bigger than just an old man moving out, like it was holding its breath, waiting to see what kind of family would live in it next, what kind of love would fill these rooms that had seen so much of both kinds, the love that builds and the love that takes, until there's nothing left to give. I left the keys on the kitchen counter next to the manila envelope containing the signed deed transfer and a cashier's check for the money I'd been putting aside for their inheritance. Money that was now theirs to use however they chose, for good or otherwise. Michael would find it eventually, probably after he'd spent hours calling lawyers and real estate agents, trying to figure out how to sell a house he'd never actually owned until this morning. By then, I'd be 40 miles away, unpacking my one suitcase in a cabin by the lake where the only sounds were water against rocks and wind through trees and the steady ticking of a clock that had finally learned to keep perfect time. My truck was parked in the driveway, loaded with the things that actually mattered, my tools, my books, the bird feeder that would find new purpose feeding different birds in a different place where hunger was met with generosity instead of complaints about property values. As I drove away, I could see Michael in the rearview mirror, standing in the doorway in his bathrobe, holding what looked like the deed transfer. His face was pale, confused, the expression of a man realizing that the ground he'd been standing on was never as solid as he'd believed. The morning sun was warm through the windshield. The radio played an old song my wife used to hum while she cooked breakfast, back when mornings meant the beginning of something good instead of just another day to endure. The road ahead was clear and straight and full of possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years. Behind me, my son was discovering what it meant to inherit not just property, but responsibility. Not just walls and windows, but the moral weight of the choices that had built them and the choices that would determine what they became next. He'd call, eventually, tonight, tomorrow, next week. He'd want to explain, to apologize, to ask me to come back and pretend nothing had changed so they could all go back to the comfortable fiction that I was the problem and they were the solution. But everything had changed. The moment I'd stopped trying to save him from learning what it cost to be a good man, everything had changed. Some lessons can't be taught. They can only be lived. And for the first time in 37 years, my son was about to start living his own lessons, instead of depending on mine to keep him afloat while he figured out how to swim. The clock on my dashboard showed 8:15. Time moving forward, carrying me toward whatever came next. I was ready for it, all of it. The lake house was smaller than I'd imagined when I'd rented it sight unseen 3 months ago, but it had everything an old man needed. A roof that didn't leak, windows that faced the water, and silence thick enough to think in. I spent the first day arranging my few belongings. The tools in the shed, the books on makeshift shelves, the bird feeder outside the kitchen window where I could watch cardinals discover that generosity had followed me to this new place. On the second day, my phone started ringing. I let it ring. Michael called 17 times that first week. I counted because each ring was a small victory, proof that consequences had weight, that actions created reactions, that 47 years of taking his father for granted had finally added up to something he couldn't ignore. I didn't answer because we'd already said everything that needed saying. He'd read my letter. He'd found the deed. He'd discovered that ownership came with a price he'd never bothered to calculate. Now he was learning what it felt like to need something from someone who wasn't automatically, endlessly available. On day 8, he drove to the lake. I watched his car pull up the gravel drive from my porch, where I'd been sitting with my morning coffee and the clock that now kept perfect time. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time before getting out, the way people do when they're preparing for conversations they don't know how to have. He looked older than I remembered, thinner. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago, the kind that come from sleeping badly and thinking too much. "Dad," he said, standing at the bottom of the porch steps like a visitor who wasn't sure he'd be welcomed inside. "Michael, can we talk?" "We're talking." He shifted his weight, that old nervous habit from childhood. "I mean, really talk. About everything." I gestured to the empty chair beside me. He climbed the steps slowly, sat down carefully, as if sudden movements might spook me into disappearing again. "The house," he said finally. "You really owned it all this time? 37 years. And you never told me because you never asked, because you assumed, because assuming was easier than understanding what it actually cost to keep you safe." I took a sip of coffee, watched a heron pick its way through the shallows. "Your mother wanted to tell you when you turned 18. I said no. When you graduated college, she brought it up again. I said no. When you got married, when Tommy was born, when you started your business, every milestone, she wanted you to know what you were inheriting and what it had cost to preserve it. Why didn't you want me to know? Because I wanted you to feel like you belonged somewhere without having to earn it. Because I thought love meant protecting you from the weight of other people's sacrifices." I set down my cup. I was wrong. Michael was quiet for a long time, watching the water. "Mrs. Rodriguez called me," he said eventually, "about the money. She wanted to thank whoever had been helping her. Thought maybe it was you." "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was you, that you'd been taking care of people without them knowing." His voice was rough. She cried. And I put $50 in an envelope and left it in her mailbox. He looked at me. "Sarah said it was enabling. I did it anyway." "Good. Mrs. Patterson's cats. What about them?" "I paid her fines, all of them, 3 months' worth, and I talked to the city council about changing the ordinance." He managed a small smile. "Turns out they'd been looking for a reason to modify it anyway. Too many complaints about people being jerks to old ladies feeding strays." I nodded, but didn't respond. These weren't gifts he was giving me. They were debts he was paying to become the man his mother had believed he could be. "The Hendersons asked me to help Tommy with his science project," he continued, "building a volcano. I spent 3 hours in their garage, covered in papier-mâché, listening to that kid explain plate tectonics like he was teaching a college course. How was it?" "The best 3 hours I've had in years." His voice caught. I forgot what it felt like to be useful to someone who actually wanted my help. A fish jumped in the lake, rings spreading across the surface until they disappeared into the larger pattern of water meeting shore. Natural consequences expanding outward, changing everything they touched. "Sarah wants to sell the house," Michael said. "Says it's too big, too old, too much work." "It's your house now, your decision." "No, it's not." He turned to look at me directly. "I mean, legally it is, but morally, I don't know what I've earned the right to decide." "Then figure it out." "How?" "The same way your grandfather figured out how to save it in 1987. The same way I figured out how to keep it for 37 years. The same way your mother figured out how to turn it into a home instead of just a building." I stood up, walked to the porch railing. "You ask yourself what you're willing to sacrifice for the people you love, and then you sacrifice it. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I can't be the man you were?" I wasn't strong. I was scared. Scared of losing everything, scared of failing your mother, scared of raising a son who didn't understand that love cost something. I turned back to him. Strength isn't holding everything together by yourself. Strength is teaching other people how to help carry the weight. Michael stood up, paced to the other end of the porch. "Sarah says, you manipulated us, set up this whole situation to make us feel guilty. What do you think?" "I think—" He stopped walking, leaned against the railing. "I think you got tired of being the only one who remembered what things cost. I think you wanted us to understand that taking care of people requires actually taking care of them, not just assuming someone else will handle the details. And I think you were right to leave. I think we needed to learn what it felt like to be responsible for something bigger than our own comfort." The sun was higher now, burning off the morning mist that had made the lake look like something from a dream. Real daylight revealed the true boundaries of water and shore, the actual distance between here and there. "Tommy asked about you," Michael said, "where his grandfather went, why you left. What did you tell him?" "The truth, that you taught me everything I needed to know, and now it was time for me to practice without a safety net." "How did he take it?" "He asked if you were coming back for his birthday." I felt something twist in my chest, that old familiar ache of wanting to fix things for people I loved. But Tommy was 16 now, old enough to learn that sometimes the people you love make hard choices that don't include you, and that's not abandonment. It's trust. What did you tell him? I told him that would depend on whether his grandfather thought we'd learned what we needed to learn. We sat in silence for a while, watching the water change colors as clouds moved across the sun. Finally, Michael spoke again. Sarah and I are in counseling. Good. She's angry about a lot of things. The money, the house, feeling like she was lied to. Were you lying to her? I was lying to myself about what I'd earned, what I deserved, what I was entitled to because of who my parents were instead of who I was. He rubbed his face. Hard to be honest with someone else when you're not even honest with yourself. Marriage is practice for being human with someone who sees all your mistakes, I said. Your mother used to say that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone whose imperfections don't make you want to run away. Did you ever want to run away from her? Every day for the first 5 years. She was stubborn, opinionated, absolutely certain she was right about everything. I smiled at the memory. She usually was. But you stayed. I stayed because leaving would have been easier. And easy isn't what makes you into someone worth being married to. I looked at him. Same reason I left you, because staying would have been easier. And easy wasn't what you needed to become the man your son needs you to be. A loon called from across the lake, that wild sound that makes you remember there are still places in the world where things are exactly what they seem to be. The business is doing well, Michael said. Better than well. That loan you guaranteed, it saved everything. I know. How do you know? Because I get the bank statements. Because I'm still the co-signer until you pay it off or refinance. I met his eyes. Because I've been watching you succeed at something you built yourself, and I'm proud of you for not giving up when it got hard. His eyes filled with tears he'd probably been holding back for weeks. Why didn't you tell me you were proud? Because pride you have to earn feels different than pride someone gives you for free. I reached over and put my hand on his shoulder the way I used to when he was small and needed reassurance that the world was safer than it seemed. But I'm telling you now. We sat there until the sun was directly overhead, not talking, just existing in the same space without needing to fix or change or improve anything. Just a father and son who'd finally learned the difference between love that protects and love that prepares. I should go, he said eventually. Sarah's making dinner. She wants to try cooking your pot roast recipe. Your mother's recipe. Right, Mom's recipe. He stood up, hesitated. Would you consider coming for dinner sometime? When you're ready? Maybe, I said. When you stop needing my permission to be a good man. When you're doing the right things because they're right, not because you're trying to prove something to me. How will I know when that happens? You'll know. I stood up and walked him to his car. And when you do, you'll understand why I had to leave for you to figure it out. He got in the car, rolled down the window. Dad. Yeah? The clock in your room. I can hear it ticking from downstairs now. It sounds different, steady. Time sounds different when you're not fighting it. He nodded and drove away, gravel crunching under his tires. I watched until his car disappeared around the bend, then walked back to the porch where my coffee was getting cold and the repaired clock was keeping perfect time. That evening, I filled the bird feeder and sat outside until the stars came out. The lake was mirror still, reflecting light from a sky that seemed close enough to touch. In the distance, I could hear the sound of fish jumping, night birds calling, the whisper of wind through trees that had been growing here since before I was born. Tomorrow, maybe I'd start writing letters to Tommy. Not because Michael had asked me to, but because a grandfather's job is to teach his grandson about the weight of choices and the value of sacrifice and the way love looks when it's strong enough to let go. But tonight, I just sat and listened to the clock tick and felt something I hadn't felt in years. The peace that comes from knowing that the people you love are finally learning to carry their own weight, to make their own choices, to build their own kind of strength. Some things can't be taught. They can only be learned. And finally, the lesson had begun. The clock chimed midnight, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. Time moving forward, carrying all of us toward whatever came next. I was ready for it, all of it. The reconciliation that might come, the distance that might remain, the understanding that love sometimes looks like letting go, and trusting that the people you've raised will remember what you taught them about being human in a world that needs more. Kindness, not less. The stars reflected in the lake looked like promises written in light on dark water. I believed every single one of them.